Margaret and Rebecca were hosting Grandpa Thompson's 92nd birthday celebration. The backyard was filled with relatives I hadn't seen in years, some I wasn't even sure I'd met before. My marketing consultant instincts kicked in immediately, analysing the scene like a brand event gone wrong. My husband Marcus leaned close to my ear, his voice barely audible over the polite chatter. "Eleanor, get your purse. We need to leave right now. Don't make a scene, just act natural." I thought he was being overly cautious, the way he gets sometimes with his psychological training making him read too much into social dynamics. That was until we reached our rental car, and he immediately locked all the doors, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the steering wheel. "Marcus, what's going on?" I asked, confused by his sudden intensity. He turned to face me, his expression deadly serious. "Something is very, very wrong here, Elena. We need to call the police." 5 minutes later, I was dialing 911, my hands shaking as I tried to explain what my psychologist husband had observed. The party had all the surface elements of a typical family gathering. Folding chairs arranged in neat rows, paper lanterns swaying gently in the afternoon breeze, someone's Bluetooth speaker, playing soft jazz that nobody was really listening to. A child ran past us holding a paper plate like a steering wheel, weaving between the adults with carefree abandon. Someone handed me a plastic champagne flute filled with what looked like grocery store sparkling wine. The bubbles were already flat. I accepted it with a polite smile, my years of client meetings having taught me to navigate awkward social situations with grace. For the first hour, everything seemed normal, if slightly uncomfortable. I stood near the appetizer table, pretending to be fascinated by the grape and cheese skewers while surveying the crowd with the analytical eye I'd developed through years of market research. Marcus stood beside me holding his wineglass but barely sipping it. I recognized that look he gets when he's in observation mode, his trained psychologist's mind cataloguing behavioral patterns and micro-expressions. He has this way of watching people that makes him seem politely engaged while he's actually conducting a psychological assessment. Margaret was absolutely in her element, moving through the crowd like a seasoned event host. She hugged relatives with theatrical warmth, dabbed at her eyes with tissues, and kept reapplying her lipstick behind napkins. Every gesture seemed perfectly choreographed to convey the grieving but brave family matriarch. Stephen sat near the barbecue grill, complaining loudly about the humidity as if the weather had personally insulted him. His voice carried that familiar tone of perpetual dissatisfaction that I remembered from childhood visits. Rebecca was predictably maintaining her distance from me, positioning herself on the opposite side of the yard. Her husband Daniel was laughing at his own jokes while nearby guests smiled politely without really listening. This was Grandpa Thompson's house, the place he'd built after his construction business really took off. It wasn't ostentatious, but it was substantial enough that neighbors had always whispered about how well he'd done for himself. The wraparound porch and mature oak trees spoke of decades of careful maintenance and genuine pride of ownership. They all lived here now, Margaret, Stephen, Rebecca, and Daniel. I suppose there was plenty of room for everyone. Marcus and I had flown in from New York the day before. For years I'd been asking when we could visit Grandpa Thompson, and the responses had always been frustratingly vague. "It's not convenient right now, Elena. He's been having some health issues. Maybe we can plan something for next year." Then, this past spring, Margaret had finally said, "If you really want to see him, Elena, you should come for his birthday celebration." I didn't hesitate. I booked our flights that same evening, thinking maybe she was finally ready to bridge the gap that had grown between us over the years. I thought maybe this invitation meant something significant, that perhaps I was being welcomed back into the family circle. The party was already in full swing when they wheeled Grandpa Thompson out from the house. He was seated in a wheelchair, his silver hair neatly combed, wearing a navy sweater vest that looked vaguely familiar from old family photos. The entire crowd erupted in applause as if he'd just made a grand entrance at a theatre premiere. I found myself frozen in place, studying his appearance with the same critical eye I use when reviewing campaign materials for inconsistencies. He looked remarkably well for someone who was supposedly 92 and dealing with serious health issues. His complexion was smooth, almost too smooth. His eyes had a distant quality, like he was listening to music that only he could hear, but not in the way I remembered from our video calls. I raised my hand in a cheerful wave, expecting the warm recognition I'd always received from him. Nothing. No response, no acknowledgement, not even a flicker of recognition in his eyes. I told myself it was just his age, that maybe his vision wasn't what it used to be. Margaret appeared beside me and whispered, "He doesn't communicate much anymore, Elena. The doctors say it's difficult for him to process conversations." I nodded as if I understood, but something felt off about her explanation. Margaret raised her champagne glass and began what felt like a carefully rehearsed toast. Her voice trembled just enough to draw sympathy from the crowd. 92 years of wisdom, love, and extraordinary generosity, she announced. He built not just our family, but gave us this wonderful life we all share. Several guests dabbed at their eyes with tissues. A woman standing behind me murmured, "How beautiful," under her breath. But Marcus didn't applaud. He didn't even move. I noticed he was staring intently at the man in the wheelchair. His expression focused in that particular way he gets when he's analysing behavioural patterns. "Marcus," I whispered, nudging him gently. "What's wrong? You're being obvious." He didn't respond immediately, just continued his intense observation, as if he was memorising every detail of the scene before us. "Marcus," I said again, more urgently this time. That's when he leaned in close to my ear. "Eleanor, get your purse. We're leaving immediately. Act completely normal." I actually let out a nervous laugh. "You're kidding, right? We just got here yesterday." But Marcus wasn't smiling. His eyes remained fixed on Grandpa Thompson with an intensity that made my stomach clench. "Get your purse now, Elena. What are you talking about? We can't just leave in the middle of his birthday party." He finally turned to look directly at me, and I could see something like fear flickering behind his professional composure. "Elena, something is very, very wrong here." It wasn't the words themselves that convinced me. It was the absolute certainty in his voice, the way he spoke like he was stating an undeniable scientific fact. My hands went cold despite the warm afternoon air. I glanced back at the man in the wheelchair. He hadn't moved from his position, his hands resting on the armrests like carefully positioned props in a stage production. "Are you completely serious right now?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Marcus was already walking toward the house, moving with purposeful calm that somehow felt more alarming than if he'd been panicking. I followed him upstairs to the guest room where we'd left our overnight bags. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. My mouth felt like I'd been chewing cotton. I kept thinking that if Marcus was wrong about this, we were about to create the most embarrassing family incident in recent memory. But if he was right, we slipped out through the front door like we were escaping from a crime scene. Nobody stopped us or even seemed to notice our departure. At our rental car, Marcus opened the passenger door for me with the kind of exaggerated courtesy you see in spy movies. Once we were both inside with the doors locked, Marcus gripped the steering wheel and looked me directly in the eyes. "Eleanor, that man in the wheelchair is not your grandfather." I used to convince myself that maybe I was imagining the differences, the way situations always seemed to play out so differently for me compared to Rebecca. Maybe I was just being overly sensitive, reading too much into family dynamics. Maybe I had a tendency toward drama that made me look for reasons to feel excluded. That's what I told myself for years, right up until the day Rebecca turned 18 and the entire household acted like she was about to board the Titanic. She stood at the front door with her duffel bag and a full scholarship to a prestigious university. Margaret was crying like someone had announced a terminal diagnosis. "You don't have to leave us, sweetheart," she kept repeating through her tears. "We'll figure out the finances somehow. Please just stay home a little longer." Meanwhile, 2 years earlier when I'd turned 18, I'd received a used suitcase and a brief nod of acknowledgement. "Time to grow up and build your own life, Elena," Stephen had said matter-of-factly. "You're an adult now. Go make something of yourself." No tears, no desperate pleas, no offers to help with packing or college planning. I don't want to sound bitter about it because, honestly, I'm not. I moved out, enrolled in college, and got on with building my life. But there's something about being ushered out the door like an overstayed house guest while your sister gets begged to remain that leaves a lasting impression. The ironic part was that I didn't even have a real choice about college. I knew I had to go not because anyone encouraged me to pursue education, but because I desperately needed a legitimate excuse to leave that house. My parents didn't contribute a single dollar to my tuition or living expenses. I don't think they even bothered to ask what I was studying. It was Grandpa Thompson who quietly stepped in to help. Every few months he'd send me money, just enough to cover rent, groceries, and the occasional emergency. No lectures about responsibility, no conditions attached, just a folded check tucked inside a note written in his distinctive handwriting. Hope this helps you build something great, Elena. So proud of watching you grow. He didn't owe me that support, but he provided it anyway, like it was the most natural thing in the world. I have vivid memories of him from my earliest childhood. Before I could even speak in complete sentences, I had Grandpa Thompson. He'd lift me up and tell me stories in that deep voice that always sounded like it held wonderful secrets. He taught me how to use basic woodworking tools when I was still wearing shoes with Velcro straps. He always smelled like cedar shavings and peppermint tea. Back then, it felt like I was his special favorite, like we had a bond that nobody else could understand. Maybe I really was his favorite. But life has a way of pulling people in different directions. College led to my first job at a small design firm. That job introduced me to Marcus at a psychology conference, where I was managing the visual presentations. Before we knew it, we were building a life together in New York City. It wasn't a dramatic escape from my family. It was opportunity, career advancement, perfect timing, and maybe, if I'm being completely honest, a sense of relief at the distance. Being far away made everything feel more manageable. It was easier not to notice how infrequently my parents called to check in. Easier to pretend that the long silences were just the natural result of busy lives and time zone differences. Easier not to feel that strange emptiness that always followed any conversation with Rebecca, no matter how friendly she tried to sound. We maintained contact, sort of. Holiday email updates, the occasional video call when schedules aligned. The last real conversation I'd had with Grandpa Thompson was during one of those video chats. He looked older but still mentally sharp and engaged. He asked thoughtful questions about my marketing work. I asked about his garden and his woodworking projects. He made a joke about the neighborhood squirrels stealing all his prized tomatoes before he could harvest them. That conversation was 4 years ago. After that, communication became increasingly limited. I'd asked to speak with him during family calls, and Margaret would explain that he was napping or wasn't feeling well enough for conversation or was too tired to focus on the phone. Eventually, she stopped facilitating those requests altogether. I convinced myself this was perfectly normal. People age, they withdraw from social interactions. Maybe talking on the phone had become genuinely difficult for him, but something about the situation never felt quite right to me. So I didn't push the issue. I had a demanding career, a growing marketing consultancy, a husband. I told myself it wasn't personal, that I hadn't been deliberately excluded from his life, just naturally left behind as family dynamics shifted over time. Then suddenly, out of nowhere came the birthday invitation. Not really an invitation, more like permission. "If you really want to see him, Elena," Margaret had said during our phone call, "you should come for his 92nd birthday." I didn't hesitate for a second. I booked our flights that very evening, convinced that this meant something significant was changing. I thought maybe this was the moment when family relationships would shift back toward inclusion, when I'd finally be welcomed back into the inner circle. Instead, I walked into a party where I recognized almost no one, stood on grass that felt completely foreign under my feet, and realized that somewhere along the way, this entire place had stopped feeling like it had any connection to me whatsoever. They all lived here now, Margaret, Stephen, Rebecca, Daniel. They'd absorbed the house like it was a natural extension of their exclusive family unit. I was just a visitor, the outsider looking in. I kept telling myself it was all in my head, that I was projecting old insecurities onto a perfectly normal family gathering, that I was being dramatic again. But then Marcus leaned in and whispered, "Get your purse." And suddenly nothing felt imaginary anymore. We sat in our rental car like we'd just committed a serious crime, or maybe like we'd barely escaped becoming victims of one. I couldn't decide which scenario felt more accurate. Marcus was gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had gone completely white. I was frozen halfway through fastening my seatbelt, as if not clicking it completely would somehow keep this surreal situation from becoming real. "What do you mean that's not him?" I asked, my voice higher than usual. Marcus didn't look at me, just stared straight ahead through the windshield. "I mean exactly what I said, Elena. That man in the wheelchair is not your grandfather." I stared at him like he'd just suggested the birthday cake was made of radioactive material. "You think someone put on some kind of disguise, like we're in a bad detective movie?" "Not a disguise. His micro-expressions are completely wrong. The way he holds his head, his eye movement patterns, even his posture in the chair." I blinked hard, trying to process what he was telling me. His posture? Marcus finally turned to face me, and I could see his professional training kicking in. Eleanor, you have to understand something about me. I've been studying human behavior and facial recognition since graduate school. I can identify someone I met briefly at a conference 3 years ago. I don't forget faces, expressions, or behavioral patterns. That man is not your grandfather. My stomach dropped like I was on a roller coaster that had just gone over the highest peak. I wanted to laugh, but not the happy kind of laughter. The kind that comes right before you completely lose control. I pressed both hands against my face, trying to think through this logically. My marketing background had taught me to analyze situations systematically, but my brain felt like it was short-circuiting. Marcus looked back toward the house where the party was continuing. What about Thomas? Didn't you mention he resembled your grandfather when they were younger? What about him? Could that be Thomas in the wheelchair? I had mentioned that years ago. Thomas did look remarkably similar to Grandpa Thompson, especially around the eyes and jawline. But that was decades ago, and besides, Thomas lived across the country. He hadn't been at the party that I'd seen. He hadn't spoken to anyone or been introduced to the guests. Oh my God, I whispered as the pieces started clicking together. Thomas was wearing different glasses than usual, and he had a beard. It wasn't obviously fake, but it changed his whole appearance. And Marcus, you're absolutely right about the behavioral differences. The way he sat, the way he didn't respond to social cues, everything was wrong. I know what I observed, Elena, Marcus said quietly. My training doesn't let me unsee these things. I pressed my forehead against the passenger window. My breath fogged the glass, and my heart felt like it was trying to punch its way out of my chest. I didn't want to believe what Marcus was telling me. I wanted to go back to a reality where this was just an awkward family party. And I was the uncomfortable outsider, the disappointing daughter visiting from out of town. That version of reality felt incredibly safe compared to this. Then where is he? I asked, my voice barely audible. Marcus didn't answer immediately. Where is Grandpa Thompson? The question hit me like a physical force, spreading through my body like ice water in my veins. Suddenly, every strange detail from the party made horrible sense. The awkward toasts, Margaret's theatrical crying, the half-empty guest list, the way nobody had let me get close to him for a real conversation. The way he'd never spoken, the way they'd shut down every attempt I'd made to interact with him directly. I haven't actually talked to him in 4 years, I said out loud, the words feeling like stones in my mouth. Marcus glanced at me with concern. What do you mean? I swallowed hard, my throat feeling like sandpaper. 4 years. The last real conversation was over video chat. He looked tired but still sharp. After that, Margaret kept saying he was too sick to talk, or he was sleeping, or he'd had a difficult day. Every single time I called, there was some excuse why I couldn't speak with him directly. I thought I was being overly sensitive, but now I realize I might have been trying to talk to someone who... I couldn't finish the sentence. Elena, Marcus said gently, I think we need to contact the authorities. I stared at him, the full weight of what he was suggesting hitting me. You mean call the police? He nodded once, his expression serious but supportive. If we're wrong about this, we'll deal with the embarrassment. But Elena, we're not wrong. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe properly. I kept picturing Margaret's face when we'd left the party, that tight smile that never reached her eyes. The slight shake of her head like I'd once again failed to meet some unspoken family expectation. I'm about to destroy everything, I whispered. Elena, Marcus said, reaching over to take my hand, you're not the one who destroyed anything. You're just the one brave enough to uncover the truth. I reached for my phone like it weighed 100 pounds. My thumb hovered over the emergency number, trembling slightly. Then I made the call. The police arrived more quickly than I'd expected. 2 detectives in plain clothes speaking in calm, professional tones. They interviewed us beside our car, asking detailed questions that felt both gentle and precise. I explained everything as clearly as I could, trying to make it sound as rational as possible under the circumstances. I know this might sound unusual, but I have reason to believe someone is impersonating my grandfather at his birthday party. I don't know where he actually is, and I'm genuinely concerned for his safety. They asked follow-up questions, the kind that feel designed to test your credibility even when they're asked with kindness. Then they nodded professionally and walked toward the house like they were making a routine social call. I remained in the car, watching the scene unfold like a movie I couldn't turn off. The party didn't immediately erupt into chaos. Nobody screamed or ran away. Somehow that made it feel even more ominous. Everything just seemed to dim slightly, like someone had adjusted the brightness settings on reality. People continued holding their drinks and making polite conversation, but their eyes started darting around nervously. Their shoulders became visibly tense. The detectives began speaking privately with different guests. I watched one of them approach Margaret. Her expression shifted from confusion to defensiveness in a matter of seconds. She started gesturing emphatically, shaking her head, speaking rapidly while her hands moved in sharp, agitated patterns. Stephen stood apart from the group, staring at the hedge line, as if it contained answers to questions he didn't want to ask out loud. I watched the detectives approach the man in the wheelchair. He didn't say a word, didn't react to their presence at all. Then one of them must have requested identification because Margaret disappeared into the house and returned with some kind of documentation. Whatever she showed them didn't resolve the situation. The detectives knelt down beside the wheelchair, speaking in voices too low for me to hear from the car. They maintained that professional composure that somehow manages to be both reassuring and terrifying. One of them eventually stood and walked away, probably to make phone calls or request backup. Eventually, the man in the wheelchair looked up and said something. Just a few words spoken so quietly I couldn't make them out from my position. Then he nodded slowly. But this was clearly just the beginning of a much larger investigation. One of the detectives returned to our car. "We need you to stay in the area for the next few hours. We'll contact you with more information as the situation develops." "Is that actually my grandfather?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly. "We're still confirming several details, but your concerns appear to be justified." He didn't provide any additional information, just repeated that they'd be in touch soon and walked back toward the house. I sat there feeling each second stretch out endlessly, the same question pounding in my head like a drumbeat. Where is he? Where is Grandpa Thompson? That evening, my phone rang with Margaret's number. When I answered, her voice was filled with a fury I'd never heard before. "How could you do this to us, Elena? How could you call the police on your own family? You think you're so much better than us because you moved away and started some fancy business." I tried to respond, but she didn't give me the chance. "You don't understand what we've been dealing with. You weren't here to see how difficult things became. We did what we thought was best for him, for all of us." "What did you do?" I managed to ask, my voice breaking. "Where is he, Margaret?" "You don't get to ask those questions." "Not now. Not after what you've done to this family." "Where is Grandpa Thompson?" The line went silent for several long seconds. Then I heard the click of her hanging up. When the police knocked on our hotel room door the next morning, I thought I might vomit from pure anxiety. Not because I was afraid of them, though there was certainly some of that, but because part of me was still desperately hoping that Marcus had simply misread the situation, that his psychological training had led him to see patterns that weren't really there. Mistaken behavioral analysis, mistaken identity, mistaken everything. But they hadn't come to arrest us or question our motives. They'd come to deliver news that changed everything I thought I knew about my family. My grandfather was dead, had been dead for over 4 years. They didn't phrase it quite so bluntly, of course. They maintained their professional composure throughout the conversation. One detective handled most of the talking while the other observed my reactions, probably assessing whether I might need medical attention. There's been a voluntary confession from family members. They've confirmed that Mr. Thompson passed away in February 2021. They claim it was from natural causes. The body was buried in a private ceremony. I sank into the hotel room chair, suddenly unable to feel my legs or hands. We're treating this as an active investigation until the medical examiner can verify the circumstances and timeline of death. The words seemed to bounce off me like rain on a car windshield. I could hear them clearly, but I couldn't absorb their meaning. 4 years. Over 4 years. I'd been sending birthday cards and holiday greetings. I'd been requesting video calls and wondering why he seemed less engaged. I'd been questioning whether I'd somehow offended him or disappointed him by moving to New York. I'd been wondering if maybe he was just tired, just confused, just too ill to maintain our relationship. He'd been gone the entire time, and nobody had told me. They hadn't told anyone outside the immediate household. I can barely remember what I said to the detectives. I think I asked whether he'd suffered. They said the investigation would determine that. I think I asked whether the man at the party had been Thomas. They confirmed that it was. I wanted to scream or break something or disappear completely. Instead, I said, "Thank you for letting me know. like a well-trained professional handling disappointing news from a client. The story began appearing online within a few days. Initially, it was just speculation on local gossip forums and Reddit threads. But then someone uploaded video footage, grainy phone recordings of the birthday toast, showing Margaret wiping theatrical tears from her eyes while the man who wasn't my grandfather sat motionless in his wheelchair, pretending to listen as if it were all genuine. This man died 4 years ago. His family held a birthday party for him anyway. He was portrayed by someone else. The internet responded predictably. First came the mocking commentary, then the wild speculation, then the complete character assassination of everyone involved. I avoided reading the comments after the first few dozen. Apparently, they saw me as a willing accomplice, a narcissistic attention seeker, and an ungrateful family member who should have just let them grieve in their own way. People had strong opinions about situations they didn't understand. People always do. Then came the phone call from a lawyer I'd never heard of. Not the family's attorney, but Grandpa Thompson's personal lawyer. Eleanor, I've been attempting to contact you for quite some time. I almost hung up, assuming it was another reporter or someone looking to exploit the situation. Your grandfather designated you as the sole beneficiary of his estate. The house, the business assets, the investment accounts, everything. I stared at the kitchen floor of our New York apartment, focusing on a grout line that had never been properly aligned. My throat felt completely dry. This wasn't confidential information, he continued gently. He informed Margaret and Rebecca of his decision years ago, right after he updated his will. Suddenly, every piece of the puzzle clicked into perfect, horrible clarity. The lies, the secrecy, the elaborate charade, the man in the wheelchair. They hadn't just been hiding his death from me. They'd been concealing it because once I knew he was gone, I would inherit everything they'd been living off of for years. As long as I didn't know he was dead, they could continue living in his house, using his money, pretending I didn't exist. I called Margaret immediately. I wasn't sure what I wanted from the conversation. Answers, maybe. An apology. Some acknowledgement of what they'd done. She answered on the second ring, her voice shaking with rage rather than grief or shame. How dare you destroy this family? You called the police on us. You've humiliated us in front of the entire community. You have absolutely no idea what you've accomplished. I tried to speak, but she continued her tirade. You weren't here during the difficult years. You don't know what it was like watching him decline. You abandoned this family and then you swoop in like some kind of hero when it's convenient for you. Where is he? I interrupted, my voice stronger than I'd expected. Silence. What happened to his body? Where did you bury him? You don't have the right to ask those questions, she said, her tone ice cold. You weren't there when he needed family. I called every year, I said, feeling anger building in my chest. You lied to me every single time. We were protecting him. We were protecting you. He didn't want his death turned into a public spectacle. He wanted peace and dignity. I actually laughed, a sound that came out bitter and broken. You didn't protect him. You robbed him. You robbed his memory. That's when she ended the call. The investigation proceeded slowly at first, then gained momentum. There were formal statements, extensive interviews, subpoenas for financial records. Eventually, the medical examiner confirmed what the family had initially claimed. Natural causes. Grandpa Thompson had died peacefully in his sleep. No evidence of violence, no signs of poisoning or neglect, just an elderly man's quiet departure from the world. I cried for the first time since the detective's visit, because finally I could mourn him properly without the terrible uncertainty that had been eating at me. But there were still the fraud charges to deal with. The impersonation, the financial deception, the systematic withholding of information. Criminal charges were filed: failure to report a death, fraudulent identity representation, illegal access to estate funds, conspiracy to commit fraud. None of them received prison sentences. They were given probation instead, closely monitored and with strict conditions. If they violated any terms of their probation, they'd face immediate incarceration. Thomas, who had played the role of my grandfather, faced his own set of charges, but his cooperation with the investigation worked in his favor. He received probation similar to the others. And me? I inherited everything. The house, the property, the remaining business assets. It wasn't an enormous fortune, not at the level that makes headlines, but it was substantial enough to explain why they'd maintained the deception for so long. I didn't force them to leave. The court system handled that. They moved out quietly without apologies or even eye contact. Margaret left a handwritten note on the kitchen counter that read, "You always were skilled at taking things you didn't earn." I burned it in the sink and watched the paper curl into ash. The first night I spent alone in that house, I settled into Grandpa Thompson's favourite armchair in the living room. I opened a bottle of wine from his collection and put my feet up on the coffee table he'd built with his own hands. The house was completely quiet, still carrying the faint scent of the wood polish he'd always used on the furniture. I didn't feel victorious or vindicated or even particularly angry anymore. I felt peaceful, and for the first time in my adult life, I didn't feel like an outsider in my own family's space. 6 months later, I made a decision that would have made Grandpa Thompson proud. I relocated my marketing consultancy to his house, converting his workshop into a modern office space while preserving all the character he'd built into it. The business has grown beyond anything I'd imagined possible, serving clients who appreciate the authentic, family-centered approach I've developed. I haven't spoken to Margaret, Stephen, or Rebecca since the investigation concluded. Not a single text message or email. Sometimes I wonder if I pushed things too far, if there might have been a way to handle the situation that preserved some kind of family relationship. Other times I wonder if I didn't push hard enough, if justice was truly served. But most of the time, I just focus on building something meaningful with the foundation Grandpa Thompson provided, both financially and spiritually. I think he would have approved of what I've created here.